They weren't warriors, but they risked death every day. These were bakers who could be executed for using the wrong flour, messengers who rode through war zones with no weapons, and men who cleaned waste from castles by crawling into sewage tunnels with a torch. While kings wrote laws and nobles planned feasts, others paid the real price for survival. This is the side of the Middle Ages that doesn't make it into the textbooks. The world of the expendable, the cursed, and the forgotten. Feudal Europe was a pyramid of power, rigid, brutal, and unforgiving. At the top stood kings who ruled by divine right. Beneath them, nobles controlled vast estates through loyalty and land grants. And under the nobles, armored knights enforced order and waged wars. Their names were recorded in charters, sung in ballads, and remembered in history. But none of them could function without the forgotten class that held everything together. The laborers whose work never made it into the scrolls. From the 11th to the 15th century, feudalism shaped nearly every aspect of European life. It was more than a political system. It was an economy, a culture, and a hierarchy locked in place by custom and violence. Lords controlled land. Vassals pledged loyalty in exchange for fiefs. And peasants, tradesmen, and service workers were bound to this system by necessity, birth, or desperation. Most people in medieval Europe never held a sword or wore a seal ring. They worked often in silence, often in danger. A miller could lose an arm to faulty equipment. A builder could fall from the scaffolding of a rising cathedral. A farmhand might die of exhaustion before 30. These were not exceptions. They were part of the cost of survival. The medieval labor force included far more than just farmers. Blacksmiths, tanners, bakers, messengers, gravediggers, gong farmers, each played a part in keeping society functional. Most earned just enough to live. Some were paid in food or shelter rather than coin. A few, like smiths or masons, earned respect in their communities. But even they faced high physical risk and little upward mobility. The church reinforced this structure with theological arguments. Suffering was presented as part of God's plan. Earthly status, no matter how low, was portrayed as secondary to spiritual obedience. The nobility used this narrative to justify their privileges, while the peasantry had little choice but to endure it. Even in cities, where tradespeople had slightly more independence, guilds enforced strict control. Apprentices labored for years before gaining a chance at full membership. Any misstep could mean expulsion or poverty. This story doesn't center on kings or conquests. It focuses on the hands that dug, carried, stitched, scraped, and hauled, not for glory but for necessity. Their lives rarely entered the records, but without them, the castles would crumble, the grain would rot, and the feudal machine would break apart. These were the people whose jobs demanded everything and gave little in return. In medieval towns and castles, where thousands lived in tightly packed quarters and waste systems were crude or non-existent, one job stood between sanitation and catastrophe: the gong farmer, hired to clear out cesspits. These men worked at the edge of society, invisible until their absence became a crisis. The word gong came from the Old English gang, meaning to go, but what they removed was waste human excrement collected in underground pits beneath public latrines, private homes, monasteries, and castles. By the late 14th century, London alone relied on dozens of these men to stop the streets from turning into open sewers. Their tools were basic: long-handled shovels, iron rakes, and thick buckets. At night, Always at night, they descended into the pits. Some wore leather hoods, others tied cloth around their faces. The stench was overwhelming, the air often filled with methane and ammonia. In enclosed spaces with poor ventilation, even a single open flame could ignite the gas, causing deadly explosions. Accidental deaths were common. Workers slipped into the slurry and drowned. Some were overcome by fumes and never woke up. In 1326, a gong farmer in York suffocated in a cesspit behind a tavern. The coroner's report described it plainly: found dead, with no foul play suspected. There was no funeral, no record of his name beyond the incident. Despite the risks, the pay was good, sometimes double what a carpenter or blacksmith could earn. The job attracted men from the poorest parts of town, often seasonal laborers or those already marginalized. Their wages came with stigma. Gong farmers were required to live outside city walls in many places, including parts of London and Bristol. Contact with them was avoided. Some towns even had laws forbidding them from entering markets during daylight, but they were essential. In 1357, a failure to clean the cesspits in London led to a surge in waterborne diseases. The mayor ordered an emergency hiring of gong farmers to work around the clock. Records from Westminster Abbey in the 15th century list regular payments to waste removers, with penalties for delays. The system depended on them, even as it shunned them. Their work also fed into larger industries. Some waste was sold to farmers as fertilizer. In parts of rural England, cesspool contents were transported to nearby fields, making gong farmers one of the early links in urban-rural waste recycling. By the end of the Middle Ages, cities began experimenting with new sewage systems, especially in places like Paris and Milan. But until modern sanitation emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was the gong farmer who kept disease at bay and streets passable, one bucket at a time. A life spent underground, inhaling poison, ignored by history. But without them, medieval life above ground would have collapsed. When the Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, it moved faster than understanding could keep up. For years, it wiped out nearly half the population. Entire towns were emptied, parishes left without priests, families erased in days. In the face of this collapse, a new figure emerged on the streets of plague-ridden cities. Clad in a long black robe, gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat, the most iconic feature was the mask, a long curved beak filled with herbs and sponges. The plague doctor. The mask was not designed for intimidation, though that became its legacy. It was based on the medical theories of the time, especially the belief in miasma or bad air as the source of disease. Physicians believed that stuffing the beak with aromatic substances like lavender, camphor, rose petals, or vinegar-soaked sponges would purify the air before it reached the lungs. It didn't work. These doctors weren't always trained physicians. Many were appointed by city councils or lords who were desperate for anyone to treat the sick, document the dead, and issue health certificates for the living. In Venice, Florence, and Marseille, plague doctors were under civic contract, expected to enter infected homes, perform autopsies, and offer what little medical care they could. That often meant lancing buboes or prescribing bloodletting, both common treatments of the time and both ineffective against Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague. In many cases, they were prohibited from interacting with the healthy population. Their work was confined to the dying. They carried wooden canes, not only as pointers but to push or examine patients from a distance. Some doctors, like the French physician Nostradamus, advised burning clothes and keeping clean air, but these precautions were the exception, not the norm. Mortality among plague doctors was extremely high. In Perugia, records from 1348 show that 3 successive plague physicians died within weeks of each other. The protective clothing, though innovative for the era, offered no real defense. The beak mask may have filtered strong odors, but it did nothing to stop fleas, the actual carriers of the disease, nor the bacteria that spread through droplets and contaminated surfaces. There was also a political dimension. Plague doctors became tools of record-keeping and control. They logged deaths, oversaw quarantines, and issued official reports. In many cities, the presence of a plague doctor meant a neighborhood had been marked. People avoided them not only out of fear of infection, but because they signaled impending death by the end of the 14th century. The figure of the plague doctor was both a symbol of medicine and of helplessness. They embodied the desperation of a society grasping for order in the face of unstoppable disease. And while the beaked masks survived as a haunting visual, the reality behind it was far from theatrical. It was the uniform of a profession where the outcome was almost always the same. You were sent into the plague, and most never returned. In the brutal logic of medieval siege warfare, brute force wasn't always the first strategy. When walls were too thick to break and gates too strong to burn, commanders turned to a method that was slower, quieter, and often more deadly. They turned to sappers. Sappers, or miners, were laborers assigned to dig tunnels beneath enemy fortifications with the goal of collapsing walls from below. It was one of the most dangerous military roles in the Middle Ages, combining physical exhaustion with constant risk of suffocation, cave-ins, fire, or execution. Siege mining wasn't new. The technique had been used since ancient times by the Assyrians, the Persians, and later the Romans. But in medieval Europe, it became more systematized. By the 12th century, many castles and walled cities had begun reinforcing their lower walls with stone-filled foundations to counter these tactics. Still, during conflicts like the 100 Years' War, mining was a recurring tactic. In 1215, at Rochester Castle in England, King John's forces tunneled under the tower, propping the chamber with wooden beams and then setting them ablaze. The resulting collapse breached the wall and forced the garrison's surrender. As sappers, Job began far from the enemy in a concealed trench or a covered structure called a mound. Using picks, wooden shovels, and baskets, teams of miners would dig toward the base of enemy walls. Tunnels were reinforced with timber, but the work was slow, stifling, and often deadly. Ventilation was poor. Water seeped through the soil. Fires were a constant threat. In some cases, enemy defenders would detect the tunnel and dig a countermine, aiming to intercept the attackers underground. When these opposing tunnels met, hand-to-hand combat took place in pitch darkness. The goal wasn't to win a skirmish. It was to kill everyone inside and collapse the tunnel. In 1346, during the siege of Calais, English miners attempted to breach the city walls. French counterminers struck back, setting fire to the sap and burying the attackers alive. None escaped. Tunnels were often packed with flammable materials, hay, pitch, sulfur, and grease, and then set ablaze to burn out the wooden supports. When they gave way, the ground above would collapse, bringing part of the wall or tower down with it. But the technique was unreliable. Soil conditions varied. Rain could flood tunnels. A miscalculation in direction or depth meant weeks of labor wasted, or worse, disaster. Sappers were rarely soldiers. Many were civilians hired for their skills in mining or earthworks. They were paid more than common footmen, but their survival rates were lower. Few left their names behind. Their deaths went unrecorded. Medieval chroniclers rarely praised sappers. Their work lacked the heroism of the cavalry or the drama of siege towers. But when a wall fell without a battering ram or catapult in sight, it was often their hands that brought it down from below, in silence, under tons of earth, surrounded by darkness, breathing dust until the tunnel collapsed or the city did. In medieval Europe, medicine was a mixture of tradition, guesswork, and inherited theory. Among its most widespread practices was bloodletting, the belief that removing blood could rebalance the body's humors and restore health. And for that, there was one essential tool: the leech. But leeches didn't appear in apothecaries. By magic, someone had to collect them by hand, from the wild, in conditions few could endure. Leech collectors worked in marshes, fens, and bogs across England, France, and parts of the German-speaking world. The best leeches were Hirudo, native to freshwater wetlands. These parasites didn't cling to stones or reeds. They latched onto warm flesh. That meant the most reliable method of harvesting them was to wade directly into the water. Bare-legged collectors, often women and children from poor rural communities, would step slowly through shallow swamps, letting the leeches attach themselves. Once the parasites had begun to feed, they were pulled off and dropped into clay pots or wooden containers. It was slow, painful work. A collector could lose dozens of small amounts of blood in a single morning. And leech bites didn't clot easily. The creature's saliva contained hirutin, a powerful anticoagulant. The bleeding could continue for hours. Infections were common. Swamp water teemed with bacteria. A leech bite that festered could lead to serious illness or death. Antibiotics didn't exist. Bandages were crude. Medical attention, if available at all, was reserved for wealthier classes. Records from the 13th and 14th centuries refer to fevered legs. Among fen dwellers and laborers, a vague term likely describing infected wounds or blood poisoning. Despite the danger, demand was high. By the 12th century, European physicians, influenced by ancient Greek and Islamic medical texts, prescribed bloodletting for everything from fevers to indigestion. In elite circles, leeches were considered more precise than blades. They were thought to draw bad blood without disturbing the body's natural balance. In the 14th and 15th centuries, large quantities of leeches were shipped to monastic infirmaries and urban physicians. Some monasteries kept their own ponds to raise them, but most relied on collectors who sold directly at markets or through middlemen. In parts of England, leech collection became a cottage industry, one sustained entirely by people who had little choice but to risk their health for a few coins. By the late Middle Ages, demand only grew, yet no medical breakthrough followed. Leeches rarely cured disease. They weakened the sick. They masked symptoms. In some cases, they sped up death. The collectors, anonymous, injured, and expendable, remained unseen in the historical record. They walked into water and came out bleeding, over and over again, to supply a system that offered them nothing in return. The image of the medieval knight is one of pageantry, honor, and glory, mounted in armor, wielding a sword, riding into battle with banners flying. But behind nearly every knight was someone younger, quieter, and far less celebrated. the squire dot from around the age of 12. Boys from noble or minor aristocratic families were placed into service as squires, the second step in a rigid path that began as a page and, ideally, ended in knighthood. But that path was long, brutal, and often deadly. For many, it ended before the armor was ever earned. A squire's life was one of relentless labor. He maintained his knight's weapons, polished the mail, cleaned the blood from swords and lances, and helped dress the knight before combat. Armor, especially full plate, was heavy and complex. In campaign conditions, it was the squire's job to inspect every strap, fasten every buckle, and ensure that his master could move, fight, and survive. On the battlefield, squires did not stand back. They followed their knight into danger, carrying spare weapons, retrieving damaged gear, tending to the wounded, and dragging the dead from the mud. In the chaos of war, they were exposed to nearly all the same risks as combatants, without the rank or the recognition. In 1415, during the Battle of Agincourt, English squires were seen pulling knights from the mud, binding wounds with torn fabric, and ferrying messages across the field. At Crecy in 1346, many squires died attempting to rescue their fallen lords. Their names rarely made it into the chronicles. Squires were also expected to manage their knight's horse, a war horse, or destrier, that could cost more than most peasants would earn in a decade. Grooming, feeding, saddling, and calming a trained warhorse was itself a high-risk task. A panicked or injured mount could crush a squire with a single kick. Their training was physical and violent. Alongside their duties, squires practiced swordsmanship, jousting, and horsemanship. They learned how to read battlefield signals, deliver commands, and maintain discipline under pressure. But even the most skilled and loyal squire was never guaranteed knighthood. Some died before the honor could be granted. Others were kept in service for years, their prospects stalled by politics, lack of wealth, or the death of their patron knight. In peacetime, their role didn't disappear. They guarded prisoners, acted as messengers, served at court, and were sometimes tasked with punishing deserters or interrogating captives. In tournaments, they prepared the arena, managed their knight's equipment, and watched from the sidelines, while others cheered. The ideals of chivalry, loyalty, bravery, honor were written by chroniclers and poets. But the lived reality was that for every knight who rode into battle, there was a boy following close behind, carrying the burden of glory without receiving it. A life of service in the shadows, with no certainty of ever stepping into the light. Europe's medieval cathedrals were architectural feats that pushed the limits of engineering, wealth, and faith. Rising over cities like Chartres, Reims, and Cologne, these massive stone structures took generations to complete. Some lasted over a century in construction. They were designed to glorify the divine. But behind every arch, spire, and vaulted ceiling was a workforce that toiled in silence, and often died in obscurity. Quarrymen were the first to suffer for these monuments. Long before a single stone was laid, they descended into pits and hillsides to extract limestone, sandstone, or granite. Working with iron picks, wedges, and hammers, they cut massive blocks by hand, surrounded by falling dust and deafening strikes. Quarries had no ventilation. Stone dust accumulated in the lungs, leading to chronic respiratory disease. Collapses were frequent. A single shift in the rock face could trap or crush workers without warning. The extracted stones were hauled by cart, sledge, or boat, sometimes over great distances. Paris's Notre Dame drew stone from quarries near Lutetia. Salisbury Cathedral in England sourced its blocks from Chilmark and Tisbury, nearly 20 kilometers away. Transport was backbreaking and exposed laborers to extreme weather, theft, and accidents. At the building site, the danger increased. Masons, carpenters, and roofers operated at dizzying heights with limited safety. Wooden scaffolding creaked under the weight of men and stone. A misstep or tool slip could mean instant death. In 1284, during the construction of Lincoln Cathedral's central tower, workers fell to their deaths when part of the scaffold gave way. No names were recorded. Only the setback was noted. Masons carved and shaped stones into precise forms. Their work required mathematical skill, physical strength, and artistic precision, but their value wasn't always recognized. Some cathedrals employed local guilds, others hired foreign workers under temporary contracts. Pay varied, but few ever rose above laborer status. Wages were seasonal. Injuries meant dismissal. Carpenters built support structures, hoists, and cranes. These were temporary frameworks that enabled construction but would never be seen once the cathedral stood. Ironworkers forged nails, hinges, and reinforcement bands. Plasterers, tilers, glazers, all contributed. All were replaceable. Oversight came from master builders or architects, sometimes monks, sometimes professionals hired by the church. They reported to bishops or patrons, those who funded the construction. These patrons had their names carved into cornerstones or written into dedicatory plaques. The laborers did not. In 1386, when construction of Milan Cathedral began, hundreds of workers were hired. Only the name of the architect, Simone da Orsenigo, was recorded. The rest, quarrymen, scaffolders, stone lifters, disappeared from history the moment the mortar dried. These cathedrals were built in the name of God, but their walls hold another legacy, one of blood, dust, and sacrifice. Not of kings or saints, but of the unnamed thousands who died lifting stone to the heavens in medieval Europe. Power often moved slower than rumor. Monarchs ruled from stone fortresses, lords governed scattered territories, and the church issued decrees that crossed continents. But none of it worked without the people who carried the messages, alone, unarmed, and always at risk. The courier messengers were the lifeblood of medieval communication. In an age without printing presses or telegraphs, vital information moved on foot, horseback, or by boat, carried by individuals trusted to reach their destination without fail. It was a role that demanded speed, discretion, and an unusual degree of courage. The dangers began the moment a courier left the walls of a town or stronghold. Roads were unreliable. Bandits operated freely in borderlands, forests, and even near well-traveled trade routes. In regions torn by conflict, messengers were fair game. During the Wars of the Roses in 15th century England, both Yorkist and Lancastrian forces intercepted and killed couriers suspected of carrying enemy intelligence. The same occurred throughout the 100 Years' War, where messages between English-held Calais and the mainland were sometimes lost, along with the men who bore them. Most messengers traveled light, no armor, no weapons beyond a dagger or short sword, if permitted. Their protection was often a wax seal or stamped letter of safe conduct. But such documents held little value in territories ruled by rival factions or in times of civil unrest. Even the church's protection wasn't always honored. In 1378, during the Western Schism, Papal envoys moving between Avignon and Rome were attacked by mercenaries paid by opposing cardinals. Disease posed another threat. During plague outbreaks, cities sealed their gates. Couriers arriving from infected areas were sometimes turned away, quarantined, or killed on suspicion. In 1349, as the Black Death swept through France, messengers sent by the King of Navarre to Paris never arrived. Their remains were later found buried hastily near an abandoned village. Despite the risks, the demand for messengers grew. Monarchs relied on them to manage far-flung holdings. Nobles used them to negotiate marriages, arrange military aid, and resolve disputes. Guilds needed updates on trade routes. Even peasants occasionally sent written petitions to lords or bishops. Though they rarely got replies, speed was crucial. In royal households, relay systems were developed. Riders changed horses at designated stops, covering great distances in short time. The English royal post, formalized in the 16th century but practiced in earlier centuries through ad hoc systems, relied on this relay model. Still, terrain, weather, and human error could delay delivery by days or end it permanently there. Names went unrecorded. Their deaths were rarely mourned, but their work shaped diplomacy, war, and law. Without them, no order could be issued, no alliance confirmed, no strategy revised. Messengers moved through chaos, unarmed, unseen, and expendable, holding nothing but parchment and the burden of urgency. In medieval England, bread wasn't just food, it was a matter of law, order, and survival. For most of the population, especially in towns and cities, bread was the staple of daily life. But unlike today, baking was tightly regulated, and for those who broke the rules, the consequences could be brutal. By the late 13th century, the English crown had formalized a series of economic laws known as the Assize of Bread and Ale, first issued in 1266 under King Henry III. This set of statutes was designed to control the quality, weight, and price of bread and, by extension, to maintain stability among the urban poor. The price of bread fluctuated based on the cost of wheat, but the penalties for violating the standards didn't fluctuate. They were harsh and often public. Bakers were held responsible not just for what they produced, but for matching their loaves to the official grain price set weekly by local authorities. If a baker's bread was found underweight, it wasn't treated as a mistake, it was treated as fraud. A few missing ounces could be interpreted as theft from the public. Inspectors were appointed in every borough to monitor ovens, weigh loaves, and enforce compliance. In cities like London, these officials were known as alconers, and bread-weigers. Punishment was swift. Bakers caught selling short-weight bread could be fined, have their ovens destroyed, or be placed in public pillories, wooden frames, that immobilized the head and hands, while townspeople threw waste and insults. In extreme cases, repeat offenders were jailed. In 1310, records from Bristol show a baker imprisoned for substituting barley into loaves advertised as pure wheat, a deception that violated the grain purity regulations. The severity of the laws reflected a deeper concern. Bread riots were real, and rulers feared famine almost as much as they feared rebellion. When crops failed or prices rose too sharply, the poor turned on the bakers first. Regulating the bread trade wasn't just economic, it was political to avoid risk. Many bakers produced what was known as the vantage loaf, giving customers a small extra portion with each purchase to account for any misweighing and avoid punishment. From this practice comes the origin of the modern baker's dozen, 13 instead of 12. Guilds offered some protection, but also enforced standards. In many towns, only licensed bakers were allowed to operate ovens. Unauthorized baking, particularly selling outside the regulated marketplace, could result in confiscation of goods and heavy penalties. Behind the rows of loaves at a market stall stood real risk. In a society where a bad harvest could spark unrest and hunger could turn violent, the humble baker worked under constant scrutiny. One loaf too light, one grain out of place. And the punishment wasn't just economic, it was public humiliation. Imprisonment, or worse. Medieval society was built on visible hierarchy and invisible labor. Kings ruled by divine sanction. Nobles held land through royal favor. Clergy mediated between heaven and earth. Beneath them stood merchants, artisans, and free peasants. But far below, often omitted from records and rarely acknowledged in chronicles, was a class that carried the true physical burden of the era, the underclass, the disposable workforce. They tanned leather in chemical pits. They dug under castles, in silence. They bled in swamps, suffocated in tunnels, and hauled stone for cathedrals whose doors they might never enter. Their work was essential, their risk constant, and their recognition non-existent. This wasn't accidental. The medieval world functioned on a logic that assigned suffering to the bottom. It was enforced not only by economic need, but by theological doctrine. Pain was seen as a form of moral purification. Poverty was accepted as part of God's plan. Those who labored in filth or risked death without glory were doing what the system expected of them, and offered little in return. Guilds and charters elevated some workers, but only if they could pay dues, own property, or trace lineage. Those without protection, the itinerant laborers, the sick, the foreign, the poor, remained outside the walls of recognition. Their deaths were not recorded. Their stories, when mentioned, came through court fines, coroner's rolls, or plague registers. Yet they built the foundations. They stabilized the cities. They kept disease in check, maintained public order, and ensured food reached the marketplace. The risk they bore made security possible for others. The cost of order was distributed unequally, not just in war, but in peace, through the daily erosion of health, safety, and dignity at the bottom of the structure. One misstep in a quarry, one exposure to plague, one loaf misweighed, and the penalty could be disfigurement, imprisonment, or death. Centuries later, the language and laws have changed, but the structure often hasn't. In many societies today, labor considered undesirable, dangerous, or dirty is still pushed to the margins, outsourced, underpaid, and unprotected. Sanitation, workers, migrant field hands, factory operatives, the titles differ. But the position within the hierarchy remains strikingly familiar. The medieval underclass didn't vanish. It evolved, still carrying risk, still sustaining systems, still expected to remain invisible. What changed is not the necessity of the work, but whether anyone is looking.